January 17, 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The lights never went out. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the wire fences, not the wooden barracks built hastily in the red clay soil, not even the American guards standing watch with rifles slung casually across their shoulders. It was the electric bulbs blazing overhead as dusk settled across the pine forests of northern Louisiana. Oberschwester Maria Schroeder stood in the processing line, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform still dusted with the grit of North Africa, and watched as those bulbs continued burning into the evening without flicker, without rationing, without end. She had expected darkness. She had expected punishment. Instead, there was light. The 23 German women who arrived at Camp Ruston that winter evening had been captured at different stages of the North African campaign. Nurses, telegraph operators, administrative staff attached to Rommel's Africa Corps. They had spent weeks in transit, moved from British custody through channels they barely understood, until they found themselves standing on American soil, exhausted and terrified. Maria's hands trembled as she clutched the small canvas bag containing everything she still owned. A photograph of her mother in Heidelberg, a comb with 3 missing teeth, a Bible with sand still caught between its pages. The propaganda had been specific about what awaited captured German personnel in American hands. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment had distributed pamphlets throughout the Wehrmacht detailing the barbarism of the transatlantic enemy, the torture, the starvation, the systematic degradation designed to break the spirit of the fatherland's defenders. Maria had read these accounts in field hospitals outside Tobruk. She had heard the stories from wounded soldiers passing through her ward, men who spoke in hushed tones about what the Americans did to prisoners, how they were worse than the Soviets because they hid their cruelty behind smiles and democratic rhetoric. She had prepared herself for brutality. She had steeled her mind for deprivation, but the lights stayed on. The American officer conducting intake, a captain whose name patch read Morrison, spoke to them through a translator, a German Jewish refugee from Brooklyn whose accent carried the soft vowels of Swabian dialect mixed with something harder, more urban. The women were told they would be assigned barracks, given bedding, provided with clothing suitable for the Louisiana climate. They would receive medical examinations. They would be fed 3 meals daily. The officer's tone was administrative, almost bored, as though processing enemy prisoners was no different than checking inventory at a warehouse. Maria watched his face for signs of the sadistic pleasure the pamphlets had promised. She found only tired efficiency. The barracks were crude, but weatherproof. Long wooden structures raised slightly off the ground, with rows of metal cots and thin mattresses. Nothing like the field hospitals she had known in Africa, where canvas walls offered no protection from sandstorms, where supplies dwindled to nothing and they cleaned wounds with wine when the antiseptic ran out. Here, each cot had 2 wool blankets. There were windows with glass, not just shutters, and everywhere those electric lights, burning steadily from fixtures mounted on the ceiling. Oberschwester Hildegard Völker, who had worked in the same field hospital as Maria outside Benghazi, sat on the cot beside her and stared upward at the bulbs. "They want us to think they're civilized," she whispered. "It's psychological warfare. They'll turn them off once we're asleep. Then they'll come." Maria said nothing. She arranged her few possessions on the small shelf beside her cot and tried to remember the breathing exercises her mother had taught her as a child. The ones that helped during air raid drills in 1918, when she was too young to understand war, but old enough to recognize terror. The lights did not go out. At 10 o'clock, a guard walked through the barracks, a young man, perhaps 20, with red hair and freckles scattered across his sunburned nose. He carried no weapon. He simply checked that the windows were secure and informed them, in broken German, that breakfast would be at 0700 hours. Then he left, locking the door from outside. The women waited in silence, each on her cot, each certain that the darkness would bring revelation. that the performance would end, that the true nature of American captivity would announce itself with boots on floorboards and violence in the dark. But the lights stayed on, and eventually, exhausted by fear and transit and the simple weight of uncertainty, they slept beneath that unwavering electric glow. Maria woke to daylight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz mixture of roasted acorns and chicory that had been standard issue in North Africa for the past year. The scent was so unexpected, so removed from the context of imprisonment, that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. She sat up on her cot and saw that other women were already stirring, confusion written across their faces as they tried to reconcile the aroma with their circumstances. Breakfast was served in a mess hall that held both German prisoners and American guards, though they ate at separate tables. Maria stood in line with a metal tray, watching as servers, prisoners themselves, she realized, men from other barracks who had volunteered for kitchen duty, ladled food onto her plate. Scrambled eggs, 2 pieces of bacon, fried potatoes, toast with butter, an orange, coffee with real cream and sugar cubes available on the table. She stared at the tray. The rations alone represented more calories than she had typically consumed in a full day during the final months in Africa. The butter was impossible. In Germany, butter had been rationed since 1939, replaced by margarine so synthetic it barely qualified as food. Sugar had become a luxury, reserved for the wounded and the very young. And oranges existed only in childhood memories, artifacts of a time before war consumed everything. Hildegard sat beside her at the long wooden table, her own tray untouched. "It's poisoned," she said quietly. "Or they're fattening us up for some purpose. Experiments, perhaps. The Jews in the camps, they say." "Eat," Maria interrupted, though her own hands were unsteady as she lifted the fork. "If they wanted us dead, we would already be dead." The scrambled eggs were still warm. The bacon was crisp. The coffee was strong enough to chase away the fog of exhausted sleep. And the orange. Maria held the orange in both hands before peeling it, feeling the textured skin, the slight give of ripeness. The orange tasted like something from another world, from a reality where nations did not tear themselves apart, and prisoners were not punished for the accident of their uniform. Around them, American guards ate the same food. Maria watched them carefully, looking for the distinction, the separate cuisine that would indicate this was performance rather than routine. But the guards ate scrambled eggs and bacon, drank coffee from the same urns, added sugar from the same bowls. One young corporal, perhaps 18 years old, sat reading a comic book while he ate, utterly disinterested in the German women 3 tables away. This was not special treatment. This was not psychological manipulation. This was normal. This was standard. This was simply how they fed people, even prisoners, even enemies. On ordinary Tuesday mornings in Louisiana, Maria felt something crack in her chest, some carefully constructed wall she had built from propaganda and necessity. She set down her fork and stared at her half-finished meal, unable to continue eating, unable to process the simple abundance before her, while knowing with absolute certainty that back home, her mother was subsisting on 1,800 calories per day of increasingly synthetic rations, that German civilians were being told to tighten their belts for final victory, that the entire economy of the fatherland had been organized around scarcity and sacrifice, and the promise that their deprivation served a higher purpose. And here, the enemy fed their prisoners oranges. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that seemed designed to systematically dismantle everything Maria had believed about captivity, about Americans, about the nature of the war itself. The women were assigned work. Light duties, mostly clerical tasks or assisting in the camp laundry. They were paid. Scrip, not real currency, but compensation nonetheless for their labor, which they could use at the camp canteen to purchase items beyond their basic necessities. The canteen stocked chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, soap that smelled of lavender, magazines, and novels. Maria stood in the canteen on her first visit and stared at the shelves as though they were museum exhibits, artifacts from a vanished civilization. In Germany, chocolate had been unavailable to civilians since 1940. Tobacco was so strictly rationed that cigarette butts were collected from ashtrays and re-rolled. Paper was precious. Soap was ersatz, made from clay and chemicals that left skin raw. And magazines. Maria could not remember the last time she had seen a magazine that was not a propaganda sheet filled with exhortations about sacrifice and victory. She purchased a Hershey bar with her scrip, more from disbelief than desire. The wrapper was silver and brown, marked with English words she barely understood. She ate it slowly, sitting on her cot that evening, while Hildegard wrote a letter home using paper from the canteen. The chocolate was sweet, milk chocolate, nothing like the bitter dark chocolate of her childhood. It tasted like abundance. It tasted like a nation that had never known real shortage, that could afford to wrap luxuries in paper and sell them to prisoners for pennies. "They're trying to corrupt us," Hildegard said, not looking up from her letter. "All of this, the food, the canteen, the work pay, they want us to forget who we are. They want us to become soft." Maria folded the empty wrapper carefully, creasing its edges. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps this is simply who they are." The letters home were not censored in the way Maria had expected. Yes, American officers reviewed them for security concerns, but they were not rewritten, not sanitized of all truth. Maria could write to her mother in Heidelberg about the food, about the electric lights that never went out, about the fact that she had gained 4 kilograms in her first month of captivity. She could describe the barracks, the work assignments, the canteen with its impossible shelves of abundance. What she could not do was reconcile these truths with the narrative she had carried from Germany. The Americans were supposed to be weakened by democracy, corrupted by racial mixing, spiritually inferior because of their devotion to materialism over ideology. The propaganda had been clear and constant. American soldiers were cowards who relied on superior numbers and industrial production because they lacked the warrior spirit of the German soldier. American civilians were decadent and soft, obsessed with comfort, while German citizens embraced sacrifice for the greatness of the folk. But if Americans were decadent, why did their guards work 12-hour shifts without complaint? If they were materialistic, why did they share their cigarettes with prisoners who had nothing? If they were spiritually inferior, why did the camp chaplain, a Methodist minister from Tennessee, offer services in German for the Lutheran women, reading from a Bible he had purchased with his own money because it mattered to him that even enemy prisoners could worship? Maria attended the first service out of habit more than faith. She sat in the makeshift chapel, a converted storage building with wooden benches and a cross fashioned from scrap lumber, and listened as Chaplain Roberts struggled through German hymns with his heavy accent. The old words sounded strange in his voice, familiar melodies made foreign by pronunciation, but he persisted with earnest determination. Pausing occasionally to check his notes, after the service, he stood by the door and shook hands with each woman, speaking in English that the translator rendered into German. "I know you are far from home," he said when Maria reached him. "I know this is difficult, but you are not forgotten, not by God, not by those who understand that all souls matter, regardless of uniform." Maria nodded, unable to speak, and walked out into the Louisiana sunshine. The camp was surrounded by pine forests that reminded her nothing of home, but the sky was the same sky, the same blue vault she had known in Heidelberg and Tobruk, and every place between. She stood breathing the warm air, scented with pine sap and red clay, and wondered if her mother had received her first letter yet, if she would believe what Maria had written, if the truth of American captivity would seem as impossible to her as it had first seemed to Maria herself. The lights stayed on. They stayed on every night, burning steadily until morning, and gradually Maria stopped expecting them to fail. She stopped waiting for the violence to begin, for the mask to slip, for the Americans to reveal themselves as the barbarians the ministry had promised. Instead, she watched as the guards changed shifts with casual efficiency, as the kitchen served meals with mechanical regularity, as the camp administrators processed paperwork and assigned duties and maintained order through routine rather than terror. It was profoundly unsettling, this normalcy. It suggested something Maria was not ready to confront, that the enemy might not be enemy in the way she had been taught, that the war might not mean what she thought it meant, that everything she had believed about the conflict and her place in it might be built on foundations as unstable as sand. In March, the Red Cross parcel arrived. Maria was called to the administration building along with the other German women, and each was presented with a cardboard box marked with the Red Cross symbol and labeled with their name and prisoner number. The boxes had been assembled in Switzerland, packed by the International Red Cross with items donated from around the world, and shipped across the Atlantic to reach even enemy prisoners held in American camps. Maria carried her box back to the barracks and opened it on her cot, while the other women opened theirs. Inside, condensed milk, canned meat, chocolate, biscuits, cheese, coffee, tea, sugar, cigarettes, soap, toothpaste, a toothbrush, sewing supplies, and a pair of wool socks. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a knitted scarf in dark blue wool, with a note in English that the translator later told her read, "From the women of Chicago, with prayers for peace." Hildegard sat on her cot, holding an identical scarf in green, staring at it as though it might transform into something comprehensible if she looked long enough. "Why?" she finally asked, to no one in particular. "Why would they send this? We are the enemy. We are bombing their cities. Our submarines are sinking their ships. Why would the women of Chicago knit scarves for us?" No one answered, because there was no answer that fit within the framework they had brought from Germany. The Nazi ideology had been explicit. War was total. Enemies were absolute. And mercy was weakness. You did not knit scarves for those who sought your destruction. You did not send chocolate to prisoners who served the regime trying to conquer the world. You certainly did not attach notes with prayers for peace, as though the enemy soldier and the enemy woman were human beings, worthy of compassion rather than obstacles to be eliminated. But here were the scarves, soft wool knitted by hand during long Chicago winters, each stitch an act of defiance against the logic of total war. Here was the chocolate, the coffee, the soap. Practical items and luxury items mixed together, sent across an ocean at great expense and effort, delivered to women who wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht, who had served the Afrika Korps, who were prisoners precisely because they had been part of the German war machine. Maria folded the scarf and placed it on her shelf, next to the photograph of her mother. That evening she wrote another letter home, trying to find words for the Red Cross parcel, for the scarf from Chicago, for the impossible generosity of a nation that fed its prisoners oranges and allowed their lights to burn through the night. She wrote 3 drafts before settling on language that felt true without feeling disloyal, that acknowledged what she was experiencing without explicitly condemning what she had left behind. "Dear Mutti," the final version began, "I am well. The Americans treat us according to the Geneva Convention. We receive Red Cross parcels with supplies from neutral countries. The women here are kind in their own way, though we remain separated by more than language. I think of you every day and hope that you are managing with the rations. I hope the air raids have not been too severe. I hope you received my last letter and that you understand I am being treated fairly, that you need not worry for my physical safety. I dream often of Heidelberg, of the Neckar in summer, of the way the light falls on the Alte Brücke in the evening. I hope I will see it again. I hope we will walk there together when this is over. With all my love, Maria." She did not write about the abundance, She did not describe the meals or the canteen or the electric lights that never failed. She suspected her mother would not believe her, that such details would seem like propaganda or delusion, that the gap between German reality and American reality had grown too vast to bridge with words on paper. The letter was reviewed, approved and sent, carried by the same postal system that moved millions of pieces of mail across America every day. The same infrastructure that functioned with such reliability that people complained when delivery was delayed by a day. In Germany, the postal system was increasingly disrupted by bombing raids and fuel shortages. In America, the mail arrived on time, even for prisoners, even for enemies, even in the middle of the largest war in human history. By summer, the heat in Louisiana had become oppressive, a thick, wet heat that made the barracks feel like ovens despite the windows being propped open for ventilation. The American guards moved slowly in the afternoons, conserving energy, and even the work assignments were adjusted to avoid the worst of the midday sun. One evening in July, as the sun finally set and the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely uncomfortable, an American officer appeared at the barracks with an announcement. The camp was organizing a recreational program. Prisoners who wished to participate could form clubs, organize activities, even request materials for hobbies. There would be a lending library. There would be sports equipment. There would be, if enough interest existed, classes in English and American history. Maria listened to the translator render the announcement into German and watched the other women's reactions. Skepticism, mostly. Confusion. The sense that this was somehow a trap, that accepting these offerings would constitute betrayal or collaboration, that maintaining dignity as prisoners required refusing anything that resembled normalcy. But Hildegard raised her hand. "Could we have music?" she asked. "Instruments? Sheet music?" The officer consulted his clipboard. "I'll put in a request," he said. "What instruments?" "Piano would be ideal, but I understand that's probably impossible. Perhaps a guitar? Some of the women sing." The officer made a note. "We'll see what we can do." 3 weeks later, a guitar arrived, along with a box of sheet music and a battered harmonica. Hildegard, who had studied piano at the Heidelberg Conservatory before the war, tuned the guitar by ear and began teaching herself to play. In the evenings, women gathered in the common area of the barracks, and Hildegard played while they sang, old folk songs, mostly songs that had nothing to do with war or politics, songs about the Rhine and the Black Forest, and the simple life of farms and villages. Maria sat listening, not singing, and felt something shift inside her that she could not name. This was not supposed to be possible. Prisoners were not supposed to have music. Enemies were not supposed to be treated with enough humanity that they could request instruments and receive them. The entire structure of Nazi ideology rested on the premise that some people mattered and some people did not, that the strong dominated the weak, that mercy was a luxury the fatherland could not afford while fighting for its survival. But here was mercy, offered casually by guards who probably did not think of it as mercy at all, who probably viewed providing a guitar to bored prisoners as simple common sense, as the kind of small accommodation that made camp administration easier because occupied prisoners caused fewer problems than desperate ones. The Americans did not seem to understand that mercy was supposed to be profound. They treated it as routine. In September, news filtered through the camp about the war's progress. The Germans were retreating on all fronts. The Western Allies had liberated Paris. The Soviets were pushing into Poland. The strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly, though the official German communiqué still spoke of final victory and wonder weapons and the will of the people. Maria received a letter from her mother, the first in 2 months. It had been heavily censored by German authorities, with entire paragraphs blacked out, but the essential message was clear. Heidelberg had been bombed. Their apartment building had been damaged but not destroyed. Her mother was staying with relatives in the countryside. Food was increasingly scarce. The mood was grim. At the bottom of the letter, written in pencil in the margin, almost invisible, were 5 words that had somehow escaped the censor. "I am glad you are safe." Maria read those words a dozen times, holding the letter up to the light to make sure she had not imagined them. Her mother had risked including that sentence, had deliberately written it small and marginal in hopes it would be overlooked, because she wanted her daughter to know that whatever was happening in Germany, whatever shortages and bombing raids and desperate last stands were consuming the fatherland, she was glad Maria was not there, glad she was safe in American captivity, where the lights stayed on and the food arrived 3 times daily. It was a kind of permission. Permission to survive. Permission to accept the abundance without guilt. Permission to acknowledge that this strange imprisonment in Louisiana was, in some profound way, better than freedom in a Germany that was burning itself to ash in pursuit of a victory that would never come. That night, Maria stood outside the barracks after lights out. Not that lights out meant darkness anymore. The camp lights burned all night for security, and the women's barracks lights stayed on until they chose to switch them off, and looked up at the stars. The Louisiana sky was different from the African sky, less vast somehow, softened by humidity and forest instead of desert emptiness. But the stars were the same stars, the same configurations she had learned as a child, the same fixed points that had guided travelers and warriors and lost souls for thousands of years. She thought about the women in Chicago who knitted scarves for German prisoners. She thought about the Methodist chaplains struggling through German hymns. She thought about the guard with red hair and freckles who checked the windows each night, unarmed, treating his duty as routine rather than confrontation. She thought about the guitar and the oranges and the electric lights that never failed. And she thought about the ideology she had carried from Germany, the belief system that divided the world into Aryan and inferior, strong and weak, worthy and disposable. That ideology had no explanation for any of this. It could not account for a nation wealthy enough to feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers, generous enough to allow enemy women to make music, confident enough in its own righteousness that it treated captivity as an administrative matter rather than an opportunity for revenge. The Nazi worldview insisted that mercy was weakness, that abundance bred decadence, that democracy was inferior to authoritarian will. But standing in the warm Louisiana night, well-fed and safe and surrounded by electric light, Maria could not make those beliefs cohere with her reality. If the Americans were weak, why were they winning? If democracy was inferior, why did it produce such staggering wealth? If mercy was weakness, why did the merciful seem so unburdened by fear? She did not have answers. She was not sure she wanted answers, because answers would require confronting the possibility that she had believed lies, had served a cause that was not merely losing but fundamentally wrong, had wasted years of her life in service to a regime that had poisoned her mind with beautiful fictions about superiority and sacrifice and historical destiny. But the lights stayed on, burning steadily through her doubt, illuminating the barracks and the pine trees and the fence line with democratic electricity that never rationed, never failed, never asked whether you deserved its glow. By December, the war news was unambiguous. Germany was collapsing. The Rhine was breached. The Allies were advancing into the fatherland itself. In the camp, the German prisoners fell into 2 camps. Those who clung desperately to belief in miracle weapons and final victory, who insisted that the setbacks were temporary, that the Führer had a plan, and those who had begun, quietly and privately, to accept that the war was lost and that whatever came next would have to be built from the ruins of their shattered certainty. Maria found herself in the second group, though she rarely spoke about it. Instead, she worked in the camp laundry, attended chapel services, wrote letters to her mother when mail was still getting through, and tried to imagine what peace would look like. She could not picture it. The war had consumed her entire adult life. She had entered military service at 19, had spent 5 years wrapped in the rhythms of military discipline and ideological certainty, and now, at 24, she was expected to envision a future without uniforms, without enemies, without the clear structure of service and duty. The Americans, she noticed, seemed unbothered by the approaching peace. They talked about going home, about jobs waiting for them in Detroit or Los Angeles or Oklahoma City, about wives and girlfriends and parents who wrote letters filled with ordinary news about neighbors and weather and local gossip. They did not seem to carry the weight of ideology that burdened the German prisoners. They had come to war as a practical matter, something that needed doing, and they would leave war the same way, returning to lives that existed independent of military service. It suggested a different relationship to nation and identity. The Americans were citizens who became soldiers. The Germans, or at least the Germans Maria had known, were Germans first, identities subsumed into the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, where individual desire was supposed to dissolve into collective purpose. The Americans seemed to have missed that lesson entirely. They remained stubbornly individual, even in uniform, even in war, even when collective effort was required. And perhaps, Maria thought, that was why they won. Because soldiers who were citizens first, who fought for homes and families and the right to return to ordinary lives, had something concrete to fight for. While soldiers who fought for abstract racial destiny and thousand-year Reichs fought for vapor, for fantasies, for promises that dissolved under the weight of reality. On Christmas Eve, the camp administration organized a celebration. There was a decorated tree in the mess hall, strung with lights and paper ornaments made by prisoners in the craft workshop. There was a special meal: roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls with butter, and pumpkin pie. There was music, with Hildegard on guitar and the American Guard playing harmonica, blending German carols with American ones in a strange bilingual harmony. Maria sat at the long table, eating turkey and listening to Stille Nacht, sung in 2 languages simultaneously, and felt tears running down her face without quite knowing why. It was not sadness exactly, though sadness was part of it. It was not joy, though relief was tangled up in the feeling. It was something closer to mourning, a grief for the years lost to lies, for the certainty she had carried and then shed, for the younger version of herself who had believed that serving the fatherland was the highest calling, and that sacrifice for the Volk would redeem all suffering. That girl was gone, dissolved somewhere between North Africa and Louisiana, between propaganda and electric light, between expectation and experience. In her place was this woman, this prisoner, this person who ate turkey on Christmas Eve and cried while singing carols, because she could no longer separate the music from the memory of what the music had once meant in a world that no longer existed. After the meal, Chaplain Roberts stood and offered a prayer in English that the translator rendered into German. He prayed for peace. He prayed for the soldiers still fighting on all fronts. He prayed for the prisoners, both American and German, both Allied and Axis, all of whom were far from home and caught in circumstances beyond their control. He prayed for wisdom for leaders and mercy for the defeated, and hope for a future where nations would not teach their children to kill each other. It was not a prayer that would have been permitted in Germany. It was too universal, too willing to acknowledge humanity across enemy lines, too soft in its insistence that mercy mattered. But here, in this camp in Louisiana, spoken by a Methodist minister to an audience of German prisoners and American guards, it seemed less like weakness and more like strength, less like naivety and more like courage, less like surrender and more like the difficult work of imagining a world beyond war. The lights stayed on after the celebration ended, burning through the night, as they had every night since Maria arrived. She lay on her cot beneath those lights and thought about her mother in Heidelberg, about whether she had enough to eat, about whether the apartment was warm, about what Christmas meant in a city being slowly bombed into rubble. She thought about the German soldiers still fighting, still believing, or at least still obeying, still dying for a cause that was already lost. And she thought about the choice she would face when the war ended, when she was repatriated to whatever remained of Germany, when she would have to decide what to do with the knowledge she had gained in captivity. Would she speak about the oranges and the electric lights, and the women from Chicago who knitted scarves? Would she tell people that the enemy had been more merciful than their own propaganda? That American abundance was real rather than decadent fiction? That democracy produced wealth while authoritarianism produced scarcity? Or would she stay silent, afraid of being labeled a traitor, afraid that truth-telling would mark her as corrupted by enemy contact, afraid that speaking about her experience would force her to confront how much of her life had been wasted in service to lies? She did not know. She suspected it would be easier to stay silent, to return to Germany and pretend that captivity had been as harsh as expected, that she had suffered appropriately, that nothing about her experience challenged the narrative Germans would need to tell themselves about why they lost and what it meant. But the lights stayed on, and in their steady glow, silence felt like its own kind of betrayal. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war ended not with drama, but with announcement. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, lasted 12, and collapsed into rubble and recrimination and the slow, terrible accounting of what had been done in its name. In Camp Ruston, the American Guards celebrated quietly. There was no wild jubilation, no excessive display. They had won, but winning meant going home. And going home was still months away while demobilization processed through military bureaucracy. They shook hands with each other, wrote letters home, and continued their duties with the same steady professionalism that had characterized their service throughout. The German prisoners reacted with silence, mostly. Some wept, some stared at walls, some retreated into defiance, insisting that the surrender was temporary, that resistance would continue, that the spirit of the Volk could not be defeated by mere military occupation. But most simply absorbed the news and tried to imagine what came next, what repatriation would mean, what Germany would look like after total defeat. Maria stood outside the barracks in the warm Louisiana spring and felt nothing at first, just a vast emptiness where reaction should have been. The war was over. She had survived. She was safe while Germany burned. She would eventually go home to a place that was no longer home, would face a future built from the wreckage of everything she had once believed. In the weeks that followed, more information filtered through about what the advancing Allies had found in Germany. The concentration camps, the systematic extermination, the industrial-scale murder of Jews and Roma and disabled people and political prisoners. The photographs were undeniable. The testimony was overwhelming. The evidence was absolute. Some prisoners insisted it was propaganda, lies manufactured by the Allies to justify their brutality. But Maria saw the looks on the American Guards' faces when they discussed the discoveries, saw the genuine horror and disgust, and knew it was true. Knew that while she had been changing bandages in field hospitals and processing paperwork for Rommel's staff, other Germans had been operating death factories, had been implementing the final solution, had been doing things so monstrous that even now her mind recoiled from fully accepting their reality. She had not known. Most of them had not known, not the specific details, not the systematic nature of the killing. But they had known something. They had seen the deportations. They had heard the rhetoric about racial purity. They had accepted the progressive dehumanization of Jews and other undesirables as necessary for national greatness. They had not asked questions. They had not demanded answers. They had looked away and told themselves it was not their concern, that their duty was to serve the fatherland, that ugly necessities were someone else's responsibility, And now they would carry that knowledge forever. The understanding that they had served a regime that murdered millions, that their service had enabled those murders even if they never personally pulled triggers or operated gas chambers, that their silence and obedience and willingness to believe comfortable lies had been part of the machinery that made the Holocaust possible. The lights stayed on, but they illuminated different things now. Not just American abundance or democratic confidence, but the contrast between one nation and another, between a society that fed its prisoners oranges and a society that industrialized murder, between a system that treated even enemies as human and a system that sorted humans into categories of worthy and expendable. Maria sat in chapel on the Sunday after the surrender and listened as Chaplain Roberts struggled through his German hymns, and she understood finally why he did it, why he persisted with his terrible accent and his earnest determination. Because treating enemies as human required effort. It required choosing, again and again, to see humanity even in those who wore the uniform of the regime that had tried to destroy everything you valued. The Americans had chosen to see her humanity, had chosen to feed her, house her, pay her for work, give her music and chocolate and scarves knitted by women in Chicago. Not because she deserved it. She was a prisoner of the Wehrmacht, had served the Afrika Korps, had been part of the machine that tried to conquer Europe, but because in their moral framework, humanity was not something you earned through worthiness. It was intrinsic. It was the starting point, not the reward. The Nazi ideology had taught that humanity was conditional, that some races possessed it fully, while others possessed it partially or not at all, that you could forfeit humanity through weakness or bloodline or political opposition. It was an ideology that inevitably led to camps and gas chambers and mass graves, because once you accepted that humanity was conditional, you had accepted that murder could be administrative, that killing could be systematic, that genocide could be policy. But the American framework suggested something different, that humanity was unconditional, that even enemies retained dignity. That mercy was not weakness, but the foundation of civilization itself. Maria did not know if she believed that yet. Belief took time, but she had seen it in practice, had lived inside it for 16 months, had experienced what it meant to be treated as human even when you were enemy, prisoner, defeated. The lights stayed on because a society wealthy enough and confident enough and fundamentally decent enough built infrastructure that did not fail. Because they had electrical grids that served everyone, that ran 24 hours daily, that treated continuous power as basic expectation rather than luxury. Because abundance, real abundance, created systems of security that did not require darkness and scarcity and fear. Germany had chosen scarcity, had organized its entire economy around sacrifice and rationing and doing without so that resources could flow to the war machine, had told its people that suffering was noble, that deprivation built character, that victory would justify every hardship. And it had lost. Lost catastrophically, lost absolutely, lost in a way that exposed every premise of Nazi ideology as lie or fantasy or murderous delusion. The Americans had chosen abundance, had built an economy that produced so much food they could feed prisoners oranges, so much electricity that lights could burn all night, so much material wealth that women in Chicago could knit scarves for German prisoners as casual charity. And they had won decisively, won with such overwhelming force that by the war's end they were fighting simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific while maintaining civilian living standards higher than most nations. Achieved during peacetime, the lights stayed on because abundance was not weakness, because wealth used wisely created power, because a nation of citizens who knew they were fighting to preserve specific liberties and prosperity and ways of life would fight harder and more effectively than soldiers who fought. For abstract racial destiny, Maria understood that now, understood it in her bones, in the extra kilograms she had gained, in the memory of oranges and chocolate and turkey on Christmas Eve, in the simple fact that she had survived captivity better fed and healthier than she had been when captured. The question was what she would do with that understanding. What any of them would do, the German prisoners who had seen behind the curtain, who knew that everything they had been taught was compromised or false, who would return to a Germany that would need to rebuild, not just its cities, but its entire moral and ideological foundation. Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. The women were processed, documented, given travel papers, and shipped back to Europe on the same vessels that had brought American troops over. Maria stood on the deck of the transport ship as it departed New York Harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty recede in the distance, and tried to memorize the feeling of American soil falling away. She was going home to Heidelberg if it still stood, to her mother if she had survived, to a Germany occupied and divided and forced to confront what it had done and what had been done to it. She was going home with a cardboard suitcase containing more possessions than she had arrived with. Clothes from the camp canteen, letters from her mother, a Bible from Chaplain Roberts, a photograph of the women from her barracks gathered around Hildegard and her guitar. And she was going home with memories that did not fit into suitcases, that could not be declared at customs, that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The memory of lights that never went out, of oranges eaten in captivity, of scarves knitted by enemy women who refused to let war erase human compassion. Germany was in ruins, they said. The cities were rubble. The economy was collapsed. Millions were displaced, hungry, traumatized by bombing and battle and the revelation of the camps. It would be years before anything resembled normal life, before the infrastructure was rebuilt, before the wounds even began to heal. Maria stood on the deck and thought about electric lights that burned through the night, about grids that did not fail, about the unglamorous miracle of abundance maintained even under the strain of global war. She thought about the work it would take to rebuild that in Germany, about whether a people who had embraced darkness could learn to value light, about whether a nation that had organized itself around scarcity could learn to build systems of plenty. She did not know. She was not sure anyone knew. But she had seen it work, had lived inside a system that treated mercy as routine and abundance as baseline expectation, had experienced what it meant when a society organized itself around the premise that all humans possessed irreducible dignity, even enemy humans, even prisoner humans, even humans who had served a regime that denied that premise absolutely. The lights stayed on. That was the lesson. The simple, profound, transformative lesson of 16 months in American captivity. The lights stayed on because someone built systems that kept them on, because someone chose infrastructure over scarcity, because someone believed that abundance was possible and desirable and worth the effort to maintain. Maria would remember that, would carry it back to Heidelberg like contraband, like a secret map to a country she had visited but could not yet name. And perhaps, if Germany could learn the lesson, if the people who had survived could build new systems from the rubble of the old, if they could organize themselves around abundance instead of scarcity, mercy instead of domination, democratic messiness instead of authoritarian certainty, perhaps then the lights would stay on in Germany too. The transport ship cut through the Atlantic, carrying its cargo of repatriated prisoners back toward a continent still smoking from war. Maria stood on deck until the Statue of Liberty disappeared completely, until there was nothing but ocean and sky and the uncertain future waiting on the other side of the water. But she remembered. She would always remember. The lights stayed on.